what is that stuff that I really like? What gives me fulfillment and joy? And, call me crazy, but like I actually do find a lot of joy in problem solving with my customers. And like, I think that's one of the beautiful things about being an AE is like, you don't just sit in your one job and work on one project. You have many projects across multiple verticals.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Bellino with Differential Selling, and the core of the work that I do at Differential Selling is based on the idea that today's best enterprise salespeople share some seller qualities. This conversation is part of a series on seller qualities, and today we're talking about belief. My guest today is Zola Petkovic. Hi, Zola.
Hi.
Zola and I met at Cloudera. She's currently an enterprise account executive at Confluent. Zola, thanks so much for joining me. Tell me about how you got into sales.
Of course. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So yeah, my journey to sales is very different from maybe a lot of people. I actually did my undergrad in biochemistry. So I was on this whole like plan to go to medical school, and the life had a totally different plan for me. So at the time of this like mental switch that I was going through, there was a company called Flatiron Health that was doing a lot of really interesting things around healthcare and big data. And so that got me super excited growing up in the Silicon Valley. I really took a moment. I thought, man, there's a lot of really neat things that can happen with both having a like bio background and being passionate about healthcare. But what we can now do with technology, like really preemptively. And so long story long, the universe heard me, and I was able to land a job at Cloudera, which at the time was about 400 people, and they were the cowboys out there doing all of the amazing personalized health initiatives, digital transformation, and really laying the foundation for big data and data lakes and everything that powers the really cool stuff that we do in the world today. So and coming from a bio background, the only job that I could get at a very technical company was sales. So, so here I am. That's my path.
I had no idea until we talked before this that you were planning on being a doctor. It's funny the way
life has weird plans, so yeah. I'm just going with it.
Yeah. The reason why I reached out to you for this conversation, one of the things that I always noticed whenever our paths crossed at Cloudera was you have this sort of like obvious passion for what you're selling, and I imagine when you're with your customers that comes out. Tell me about that. Is that something that's like intentional, or is that just part of your personality?
I think it's a couple of things. So if I'm sure I speak for everybody, but if you're not interested in something, you're not going to do well in it, and there's no way that you can be successful if you're just mediocre. So like having curiosity, I think is like, it's a fundamental metric for being incredibly successful, but also fulfilled in life. And part of that is, I will argue, is a little bit part of like my undergrad. So like as a pre-med or like, working in a research lab at Stanford and being biochem, like you learn about the scientific method, which the whole principle there is like, there's an observation about something going on in the world. And from observing something, just curiosity, you build a hypothesis. And from that hypothesis, you build out a method of either like evaluating or testing what is going on. And the interesting thing about that is that it, like, for whatever reason, I feel like that is such an important way to look at life, because you're always asking questions, you're always really curious, you're always thinking about everything that's going on rather than living in a vacuum. And so that is kind of one of the things that I used, because let's be honest, going from like biochem into like, big data, as my dad said, you don't even know what a network is. I mean, from a biological perspective, I get that, but like networking, he was like, what are you doing? So I had to kind of rely on the tools that I knew. And the best thing I could do was just nerd out with my customers and be like, why does this matter? Like, why would you use Impala? Or like, why is HBase so important to you? Like, tell me more about it. And what ended up happening is like, number one, the customers, they love to talk about what they're building because they spend 10 hours a day on this project that like probably nobody asks about, but it's their life, right? You spend more time working on this stuff than you are at home. And so just in the act of asking, people love to share. And if you're very thoughtful about the questions you ask, it requires obviously a lot of homework and research. But if you can ask good questions, what that shows is that you've cared enough to understand the world that they live in and that you want to know what's going to make them successful. And it creates this really symbiotic relationship where you're effectively building a level of trust where the customer is going to think, hey, this person like actually cares. So if I tell her something, she's going to she is are going to understand that this is like very important to me and they're going to make me successful. And I am very much a firm believer that like we are like, I'm fascinated by human decision making and evolutionary biology and all that stuff, but like we are still very, very much like biological humans that are driven by activities from like millennia, right? And so you are going to, feel comfortable around the person that you feel safe with, that you trust. And I think that's a massively important piece of like what our job is, because we are this like in between piece of like, here's like a very tangible, I mean, I still think software is like freaking intangible, but here's this like very 2-dimensional thing that I'm trying to sell to a very multidimensional human, right? And how they adopt that and take it. So having that curiosity was really a survival element for me. So I like could find my way around in a world that like I had no like sales training or background, or I didn't know how to read it. I didn't know what a 10K was. I didn't know what a round table was. I was like, round table, we're going to pizza, like, and so being able to like really have that critical thinking, the curiosity, and I guess I'm maybe a little too bubbly, but that really helped build this relationship with these customers that I think, for me is like what's made me really successful, but it also makes it really personal. So like you can then, you don't ever have to go back and remember, like if somebody asks you, oh, tell me what's the like strategic objectives of this customer and account. You're like, I know this is like, because it's personal to me. So hopefully that answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have no idea who said that. I've heard it said, you're only interesting to the extent that you're interested, right?
Yes.
That's what engages people. And I remember in my very first job selling, I was doing an inside role. And so, smiling and dialing. And I remember my manager literally said, he's like, be sure that you're smiling, because people can hear, like your voice sounds different when you smile versus when you're not smiling, and people can hear the enthusiasm. And so, I hear what you're saying about, having that curiosity and making it personal, but there's almost something about the fact that you are genuinely interested, that you really care about what's happening, that brings something out in the customer too, whether it's building trust or helping them share more, or
I mean, one of my favorite people in sales, my old boss at Cloudera, we would always talk about, I mean, a lot of, components of what it takes to be really good at, and it's not just selling. I think like sales is such a bad way to call it this, now, because it's like, it's really a completely different job. Like you're having to analyze multiple different personalities in a room. Like you've got executives, you've got developers, you've got, everybody who has a different like characteristic trait and like value that they bring to the table. And you're supposed to find ways that you can connect to all of these different humans and personalities, and what are their motivators. And, storytelling becomes a really big part of that. And so like, if you're not curious and if you're not smiling, it's hard to like bob and weave through all of these different personalities in a room to tie in and build a story that like everybody wants to be a part of. And like just earlier today, I was on a call with a head of innovation that I was like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where this is going to go. But just because I'm so curious about like, what is he thinking about and what is he doing? And I obviously did homework. We went like an hour and a half, and we basically mapped out his entire strategy of like, what is his dream state or what's nirvana for him. And all of that like just came out because I get like really excited and I'm like, oh my gosh, tell me more. And like, I just read this, really good, cool, research paper and, or this story, how does that affect you guys? And, it's almost like you're greasing the wheel for the conversation. Like my job is not to be the one that's talking, because if I mean, I know in this scenario, I'm doing all the talking, but like, if I'm doing all of the talking, and I'm like robotic and I'm like just regurgitating stuff, it doesn't give the like person with all the rich data an opportunity to tell me. And so like the whole thing for me about curiosity and like asking questions and stuff is like, you want to create a safe environment for this customer to be able to just like open up on like everything that they've ever thought about. I mean, the caveat is we're really lucky. Like, I think Kafka is a super interesting tech that is powering some great stuff. So like the conversations can be super interesting. So I'm very lucky in that part. But like, that's what you want, is you want your curiosity to open doors for things that you never thought the customer was talking about. Because the thing I learned at Cloudera, from like Rob Ryan and from like Marty Lurie and like the amazing people I worked with, I learned everything when I was spending time with my customer. And I would learn about like out of the vacuum, what are the really practical ways that they were actually using things? What were they thinking about? What was the new trend that was coming into play? What did I have to think about? How do they like fit in the political landscape of their company? How is it a top down, bottoms up approach? Like everything, like your formal training is absolutely like at the customer like site and just sitting there and absorbing everything they tell you, like, but consistently. So, and you got to be like, honestly, you got to be genuinely curious if you're going to be spending that much time with people and asking them questions all the time. Otherwise it's going to be a little bit rough, man. But that's how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned like sales is kind of a terrible name for it, and selling as a profession, salespeople, have this mentality of like, oh, salespeople are coin operated, or sellers are mercenaries, right? They're there to get the job done and collect their check. And so like, I guess my question for you is, because it sounds like what's fueling this curiosity for you is like a genuine interest in the customer, but also a genuine like enthusiasm for what you're selling. Like you mentioned right now, you're working with Kafka, and like there's some really, really cool things that get you excited. So is that like, how do you generate that? Does that come naturally to you? Do you wake up in the morning and think, okay, I got to get myself excited about Kafka today? Like,
I mean, I think like where I get really excited, I agree with you. Like, I'm not like, selling implies that I'm like forcing something that somebody doesn't need, and making money off of them. And it is in it, like, I'm big on like, using good words and stuff and being impeccable with your words and stuff. But I think that like that's not the role that we play. Like I'm the translation layer of like what the customer is trying to achieve, and then figuring out how does my solution help them achieve that better, faster, easier, and mitigate risk doing it. And so I think like where I get really excited is, obviously there's a lot of science and math that goes into making sure that a customer is like bought in, and there's the legal and there's all of that stuff. But like once you pass that like motion of landing a customer, that's where the fun really starts for me, is because it's like you are starting to like really see the magic happen, because it's like that's where the technology, is starting to deliver on really neat things. Like, Walmart, for example, can do incredible things, which might also creep people out, about knowing where you are and what you might need. And then they send you like neat things to your telephone. Oh my God, what am I, I'm 80? Your cell phone. Or like one of the really cool things we did at Cloudera was, we helped one company leverage over 30 data points from all the medical equipment tied to a patient to predict 8 hours in advance who was going to get a heart attack. And it's like, how you can't not be curious in stuff like that. I mean, there's cool stuff that people are doing. And that goes back to like the whole curiosity thing. Like, we get to work with those guys, the developers, engineers, whatever, that are building this stuff. And they probably think it's cool too, because they're still working at that company. And so if you can be super excited about that, you don't become a salesperson. You become like, you're an extension of your company into that customer, right? So that you're the feedback loop, providing all the critical information for your leadership and management to continue to provide value to that customer. But you're also the representative or extension of that team, from a customer perspective of like, hey, I'm not the expert here, but like, this is what I'm doing and this is what I care about. Like, help me do that. And so you kind of like, you know, people call consultants, but I don't even know, like triage or orchestrator, whatever you want to call it, but it's way more than sales. It's way more than sales. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how important it is. So in the gig that I'm doing now, talk with a lot of companies, a lot of sales organizations, and there are sales organizations out there that are not interested in their sellers developing relationships and being curious. They want them to read a script. They want them to do the metrics, right? Follow the process, get the deal and move on. So how do you, what do you make of that, number one? And then how do you find an employer that values that curiosity, that passion, the belief thing that makes selling so much fun?
Yeah, it's super interesting because this is something I've been thinking about for a while, because I do feel that there's a bifurcation in like sales methodology or strategy from a very, very high level. But I think, again, like I started selling at Cloudera, which was an amazing place because it was a disruptive technology and it was like the Wild West. We were like, everybody that was either using or building Cloudera was trying to change the world. And it was a very technically heavy technology. And you had to have some level of like ability and stamina to be able to stick through it. And that really, filtered out, there's always going to be like sales gigs that are really just coin operated and they're transactional. And I think one of the trends that is really emphasizing that more kind of robotic transactional type of selling is cloud, right? That transactional, I don't need to be, it's not, front loaded and heavy to be able to close a deal, right? The customer can just use it and you're there to just do the math and follow the protocol and the rules and, the talk track that we've given you. And like, and I think the other thing is like, it's very hard to scale. When you become a public company, it becomes very hard to actually meet linearity and objectives of the market unless you are very, very good at like optimizing for like expectations and reproducibility and like just being able to deliver. And so part of that is, I think, a challenge of like companies at a certain inflection point or size, right? What they're trying to do. But I think that's the interesting thing about the fact that there's so much innovation in like series A, B, and C companies where, and in between Confluent and Cloudera, I spent a little bit of time, at an ML deep learning company. And so like, I still love that space. And what's really interesting there is like, you talk to anybody in those kinds of companies and there's no roadmap. Like people don't know how to buy for ML. Like there's maybe like some really vanilla, like logistical regression or whatever for data science, but it reminds me of the times at Cloudera where like nobody knew how to buy for unstructured data. Nobody knew how to build a strategy. So you really had to like, when I started there, I was writing emails of like, this is why you should care about this kind of data, where now a lot of that has been operationalized, right? People know how to buy data. We've got business value teams, all of that exists. So like, there's less and less required on the AE to figure that out. But you look at these smaller companies and they're like, we need people that are not in it for just the money because it takes a lot more. Like you have to play many, many roles. You have to be very curious and you have to be a problem solver because like there is no map. There is no guide. Like we have to figure this out. And so I think it ends up being like a personal decision of like, if I just want really good stock and I just want to show up and be told what to do and like want to know that that stock's going to rise and I'm going to make this much a year on average and that's all I need. And that's important for a lot of people. There are millions of jobs that do that and they do that really well and they've turned that into like an science, right? Like there's a lot of companies that we know right now that that's what they do. It's very much a like mapped out like recipe on how to be successful. And it's not rocket science, I mean, it's like, top of the funnel stuff and med pick and all of it. But I do think that there is a much smaller percentage of like the philosophy around the kind of relationship selling that we do at this point. I think we've like, back in the day, salespeople were the only like access to information. So you had to build a relationship with your rep to be able to get that info. Now we don't, and it's transactional, but I think we're coming back around to a place where there's so much that customers can just use that they actually do need somebody who's going to be in there like that they trust, helping them navigate through all of this stuff. So it's, I mean, life ebbs and flows, right? So I think there's, it's important to kind of use the power of each side. But I do think like that there is a big difference in philosophies of like, what's happening to sales and what is good, salespeople. And a book that I really loved, a couple of them, The Undoing Project, which is really great. That's one about Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman about like how people think rationally. We actually don't, which is super interesting. So there's a lot of like decision science in there, but the Creativity Inc. and Ride of a Lifetime. So Pixar and Disney. And it's all about like how they've created the creative, like successful machine of Pixar and Disney. And all of that is around the fact that leadership is maniacally obsessed with allowing people to feel like they can be innovative and make mistakes and get creative and be curious. And like, I think that speaks, that's a very important thing to constantly like emphasize. It's hard to forecast though, because that's very soft and squishy. And so I get it that like as sales leadership, that's super scary because you can't define it. It's not as quantifiable. But I'll argue that like, the best salespeople in the world are probably like super freaking curious, and they probably have collected more than possible data by being curious and building a relationship with their customer than by going in and just looking at Bant and trying to answer MedPick, right? And so like that's, I guess there's a balance, and I'm probably pissing off, people who like, anyway, but that's just my opinion. That's what's worked for me.
I'm high-fiving you from over here, so you're good.
Okay.
Well, but that brings up another good point though, because so much of that curiosity, like you said, it's so effective. It's largely driven by genuine interest in the customer, genuine enthusiasm and passion for what you're representing, what you're doing. My first job was selling mainframe database utilities, and I could not have cared less about that, right? And there were people I was selling to that had built a career around that, and they cared about that a lot. But I was like, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. So how have you found to walk the line? Like, if you're somebody, if you're starting your career out, are you going out looking for your true passion, and you want to find a company that represents something that you're really passionate about so you can believe in it? Or are you going to go find an opportunity somewhere and maybe grow a passion that you didn't know you had? How do you walk that line?
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic. And there are some really cool star talks that cover this, and they talk about like geniuses and creativity and all this other stuff. But like, I think, when you're young, you come out thinking that you're going to get your dream job right off the boat. And the truth of the matter is that you're going to have to put in your time, because like in your 20s, I think it's super important to start gathering all of the information about like how you function in this world, right? And all of that is going to buy you, hopefully by then you've done enough like introspection or work or like failures, which I think we don't emphasize failure enough, because that's where you really learn. because it requires you to stop and think, and feeling uncomfortable is a place that creates a lot of change and innovation in thyself. And so I think like it's kind of both things. Like you've got to just start somewhere and navigate, because if you don't know, like, then you just don't know. And like I was all over the board. I did like, research at Stanford after college, and then medical device sales, and then I was working for a surgeon, and then I was like, wait, all right, I don't like any of this. Now I'm going to go into tech. And by then I was like 28 when I like started, like brand new. And I think the interesting thing in some of the stuff that I've read, it is like you owe it to yourself to be very clear with like what are the things that you like. And I'm not talking about like, oh, I hate filling out Salesforce. Like I always joke, like you get your base salary to cover the stuff you don't want to do day to day. But like big picture, your job to yourself is to figure out like what is it that excites me and inspires me, complemented with like what am I good at. And part of life is navigating that. I mean, I think we live in a new world where it's almost a little bit frightening because you can do anything you want and you can switch careers at any second. It's not like you start on a like corporate ladder and that's it, like that's where you're going. And so I think, like it's super important. Like the one Star Talk that I was listening to, they were talking about geniuses, and they're like, it's not the fact that they're a genius, it's the fact that they commit the more time than anybody else on a topic that they love. And that really stuck with me, because it's like, well, that's what it's about, is like, find that thing. Well, you also have to obviously be practical and make sure that you can, pay your mortgage and whatever like financial responsibilities you have. But after that, like, what is that stuff that I really like? What gives me fulfillment and joy? And, call me crazy, but like, I actually do find a lot of joy in problem solving with my customers. And like, I think that's one of the beautiful things about being an AE is like, you don't just sit in your one job and work on one project. You have many projects across multiple verticals. So you can get experience of like, hey, this is what's going on in manufacturing right now. Like, is that cool or not? Like, here's what's going on in healthcare, pharmaceutical, retail, media. Like, it's, the world is your oyster, and you can really start thinking about like, okay, well, what maybe certain industries interest me. So is there like applications and like companies that are focused on a certain like use case that I want, or do I want to be like a fundament, and I'm focusing on sales here, but like, or do I want to be a like foundational infrastructure piece that powers any vertical, like, and I think again, this ties back to curiosity and caring, because you got to be curious enough about yourself and what you like to do to be able to find like, okay, well then what am I good at? And what do I enjoy is more important, because if you enjoy it, you will continue to read and be curious and, improve your skills and craft all the time, which, that's the most important. Well, evolve or die is like the rule of life. So anyway, that's everybody out there, the theme out there is curiosity. Okay. So like,
well, and like for the folks at home, this is why I called Zola, because like you're making me nostalgic for my old sales job and getting to like hang out with customers and learn about what's going on in the CPG world and what's happening in healthcare and what's happening in tech. Like it is, it's a rare thing that we get to do every day. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is very cool. Yeah, I'm very lucky.
Yeah. But there are some days where you're just not feeling it, right? There are some days where, or there are things, that happen with the company that you're working for, whether it be changes in leadership or direction, or there's a merger announced or something, and you're just like that, that enthusiasm kind of takes a hit. So what do you do on days like that? What do you do when you're like, I can't do this again. I don't want to talk more about Kafka right now.
I mean, maybe I'm a little bit insane, but like I will take a step back and be like, look at what's going on in the world. This is not a problem, right? So there's just that one thing of like, let's be realists here. Like, look at what happened last year, crazy. Look at what's happening this year. Like the fact that I get to complain about, anything going wrong selling tech and, creating a good life for myself because of that, is that kind of calibrates you a little bit. But I think this is actually a very interesting question because I've thought about it a lot. And I think that, a lot of people love or want to talk about sales because all you hear about from sales is the like rep that's making, 7 figures, right? You always hear about the successes. You do not hear about the sales reps that are not doing well, right? And so everybody thinks it's just this like job where you just sit there and look pretty and like schmooze with people and pretty or handsome, sorry, I'll apply. And you schmooze and you make money. And it's like, the truth of the matter is that more often than not, you are dealing with like not great situations and uncomfortable situations and stressful situations. And what I'm finding is aside from curiosity, one of the big differences in like what makes people really good salespeople is hustle and being proactive. And so like I am a paranoid human being in many ways. I thank my Serbian mother for that. I, also, will point to like the sciences where they teach you, think of everything that could go wrong when you're doing this experiment and blah, blah, blah. But what salespeople that are very, very effective do is even in a time of like where everything is falling apart or going wrong, you still remain focused. You still think about what you need to do, even if you've heard 1,000 no's, and you're constantly being proactive. You cannot be successful in a world being reactive. I mean, if we look at how companies are investing in tech, they're all spending billions of dollars on being proactive, right? Predictive and proactive. We cannot be reactive in any way if we want to be successful. You have to be a step ahead of the game. You have to be pulling people forward. You have to constantly be in that state of like thinking about how can I make this better? How can I change this back to be in my favor? And that's, you won't do that if you don't enjoy your job, right? And if you're not fulfilled by the thing that you're doing, and if you don't like what you're doing. And so part of that, goes back to all that curiosity and being interested just from a personal perspective, but like, there's a little bit about, having that ability to constantly persevere no matter what. Like you can't give up. And even if somebody says like, well, this isn't working and this isn't happening, say, okay, well, what about this? And why don't we try that? And you just keep pushing. I think that's super important. Yeah. So a little bit of realism, a little bit of healthy paranoia, a lot of hustle. That's the combo.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Any final advice? If you think about there are a lot of salespeople out there right now that might feel stuck. They're at a company they don't believe in. They're selling to customers that they feel like they're not interested in. They're digging hard to find that curiosity. Do you have any other advice, last minute tips, resources that you'd point them to?
Yeah, I mean, like build your little village, like build your tribe of people that you trust from like customers, different like parts of your business. Find your mentors, do a bunch of reading, like absorb as much as you can. That's kind of what life is about, right? And so I think, for people looking for help, there's so much out there on the internet, and there's people that are looking to coach and help, and people that have a lot of fulfillment of helping others. And you find your way. Like if you want to, I'm a firm believer in like, if you are determined to find your way, I'm going to start coughing 1 second. You will do it. Like it, life is full of ups and downs. Things aren't always ideal, but if you stay determined, there's so many people that want to give good advice out there. There are like coaches and, former salespeople, and like, you can learn from the guy down the street, like ask your customers, but you can build your relationship with your customer by asking for their like advice. Like, what would you do? What's interesting to you? So I think it's just, finding inspiration from like everything that's around you, kind of, and then put together your thesis of like, what is it that's going to make you happy and successful?
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a great way to close this out, but
that's perfect.
That would be
on that uplifting note, we will I can't think of a better way to end it. So,
awesome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.